Section 1 of Actions and Reactions. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Actions and Reactions by Rudyard Kipling. An Habitation Enforced. My friend, if cause doth rest thee, ere folly hath much oppressed thee, far from acquaintance guess thee, where country may digest thee, thank God that so hath blessed thee, and sit down, Robin, and rest thee. Thomas Tusser. It came without warning at the very hour his hand was outstretched to crumble the Holtz and Gunsberg combine. The New York doctors called it overwork, and he lay in a darkened room, one ankle crossed above the other, tongue pressed into palate, wondering whether the next brain surge of prickly fires would drive his soul from all anchorages. At last they gave judgment. With care he might in 2 years return to the arena, but for the present he must go across the water and do not work whatever. He accepted the terms. It was capitulation, but the combine that had shivered beneath his knife gave him all the honours of war. Gunsberg himself, full of condolences, came to the steamer and filled the Chapin's suite of cabins with overwhelming flower-works. "Smilax," said George Chapin when he saw them. "Fitz is right. I'm dead, only I don't see why he left out the in memoriam on the ribbons." "Nonsense," his wife answered, and poured him his tincture. "You'll be back before you can think." He looked at himself in the mirror, surprised that his face had not been branded by the hells of the past 3 months. The noise of the decks worried him, and he lay down, his tongue only a little pressed against his palate. An hour later he said, "Sophie, I feel sorry about taking you away from everything like this. I suppose we're the 2 loneliest people on God's earth tonight," said Sophie, his wife, and kissed him. "Isn't it something to you that we're going together?" They drifted about Europe for months, sometimes alone, sometimes with chance-met gypsies of their own land. From the North Cape to the Blue Grotto at Capri they wandered, because the next steamer headed that way, or because someone had set them on the road. The doctors had warned Sophie that Chapin was not to take interest even in other men's interests, but a familiar sensation at the back of the neck after 1 hour's keen talk with the now-hymned railway magnate saved her any trouble. He nearly wept. "And I'm over 30, he said, with all I meant to do." "Let's call it a honeymoon," said Sophie. "Do you know, in all the 6 years we've been married, you've never told me what you meant to do with your life." "With my life? What's the use? It's finished now." Sophie looked up quickly from the Bay of Naples. "As far as my business goes, I shall have to live on my rents, like that architect at St. Moritz." "You'll get better if you don't worry, and even if it takes time, there are worse things than—" "How much have you?" "Between 4 and 5 million. But it isn't the money. You know it isn't. It's the principle. How could you respect me? You never did the first year after we married, till I went to work like the others. Our tradition and upbringing are against it. We can't accept those ideals." "Well, I suppose I married you for some sort of ideal," she answered, and they returned to their 43rd hotel. In England they missed the alien tongues of continental streets that reminded them of their own polyglot cities. In England all men spoke one tongue, speciously like American to the ear, but on cross-examination unintelligible. But you have not seen England," said a lady with iron-grey hair. They had met her in Vienna, Bayreuth, and Florence, and were grateful to find her again at Claridge's, for she commanded situations and knew where prescriptions are most carefully made up. "You ought to take an interest in the home of our ancestors, as I do." "I've tried for a week, Mrs. Shantz," said Sophie, "but I never get any further than tipping German waiters." "These are not the true types," Mrs. Shantz went on. "I know where you should go." Chapin pricked up his ears, anxious to run anywhere from the streets on which quick men, something of his kidney, did the business denied to him. "We hear and we obey, Mrs. Shantz," said Sophie, feeling his unrest as he drank the loathed British tea. Mrs. Shunt smiled and took them in hand. She wrote widely and telegraphed far on their behalf, till, armed with her letter of introduction, she drove them into that wilderness which is reached from an ash barrel of a station called Charing Cross, the way to go to Rockets, the farm of one Cloak, in the southern counties, where she assured them they would meet the genuine England of folklore and song. Rockets they found after some hours, 4 miles from a station, and so far as they could judge in the bumpy darkness, twice as many from a road. Trees, kine, and the outlines of barns showed shadowy about them when they alighted, and Mr. and Mrs. Cloak, at the open door of a deep stone-floored kitchen, made them shyly welcome. They lay in an attic beneath a wavy whitewashed ceiling, and because it rained, a wood fire was made in an iron basket on a brick hearth, and they fell asleep to the chirping of mice and the whimper of flames. When they woke it was a fair day, full of the noises of birds, the smell of bogs, lavender, and fried bacon mixed with an elemental smell they had never met before. "This," said Sophie, nearly pushing out the thin casement in an attempt to see round the corner, "is—what did the hack cabman say to the railway porter about my trunk? Quite on the top?" "No, a little bit of all right. I feel further away from anywhere than I've ever felt in my life. We must find out where the telegraph office is." "Who cares?" said Sophie, wandering about, hair-brush in hand, to admire the illustrated weekly pictures pasted on door and cupboard. But there was no rest for the alien soul till he had made sure of the telegraph office. He asked the Cloak's daughter, laying breakfast while Sophie plunged her face in the lavender bush outside the low window. "Go to the stile at top of the barn field," said Mary, "and look across Pardon's to the next spire. It's directly under. You can't miss it. Not if you keep to the footpath. My sister's the telegraphist there, but you're in the 3-mile radius, sir. The boy delivers telegrams directly to this door from Pardon's village." "One has to take a good deal on trust in this country," he murmured. Sophie looked at the close turf, scarred only with last night's wheels, at 2 ruts which wound round a rickyard, and at the circle of still orchard about the half-timbered house. "What's the matter with it?" she said. "Telegrams delivered to the Vale of Avalon, of course." And she beckoned in an earnest-eyed hound of engaging manners and no engagements, who answered at times to the name of Rumbler. He led them, after breakfast, to the rise behind the house where the stile stood against the skyline, and "I wonder what we shall find now," said Sophie, frankly prancing with joy on the grass. It was a slope of gap-hedged fields possessed to their centres by clumps of brambles. Gates were not, and the rabbit-mined, cattle-wrapped posts leaned out and in. A narrow path doubled among the bushes. Scores of white tails twinkled before the racing hound, and a hawk rose whistling shrilly. "No roads, no nothing," said Sophie, her short skirt hooked by briars. "I thought all England was a garden. There's your spire, George, across the valley. How curious!" They walked toward it through an all-abandoned land. Here they found the ghost of a patch of lucerne that had refused to die; there a harsh fallow surrendered to yard-high thistles; and here a breadth of rampant kelp, feigning to be lawful crop. In the ungrazed pastures swaths of dead stuff caught their feet, and the ground beneath glistened with sweat. At the bottom of the valley a little brook had undermined its footbridge, and frothed in the wreckage. But there stood great woods on the slopes beyond, old, tall, and brilliant, like unfaded tapestries against the walls of a ruined house. "All this within 100 miles of London," he said. "Looks as if it had had nervous prostration too." The footpath turned the shoulder of the slope, through a thicket of rank rhododendrons, and crossed what had once been a carriage drive, which ended in the shadow of 2 gigantic holm oaks. "A house," said Sophie in a whisper. "A colonial house." Behind the blue-green of the twin trees rose a dark bluish brick Georgian pile, with a shell-shaped fanlight over its pillared door. The hound had gone off on his own foolish quests. Except for some stir in the branches and the fright of 4 startled magpies, there was neither life nor sound about the square house, but it looked out of its long windows most friendlily. Charmed to meet you, I'm sure, said Sophie, and curtsied to the ground. George, this is history I can understand. We began here, she curtsied again. The June sunshine twinkled on all the lights. It was as though an old lady, wise in 3 generations' experience, but for the present sitting out, bent to listen to her flushed and eager grandchild. I must look. Sophie tiptoed to a window and shaded her eyes with her hand. Oh, this room's half full of cotton bales, wool, I suppose. But I can see a bit of the mantelpiece. George, do come. Isn't that someone? She fell back behind her husband. The front door opened slowly to show the hound, his nose white with milk, in charge of an ancient of days, clad in a blue linen ephod curiously gathered on breast and shoulders. Certainly, said George half aloud. Father Time himself. This is where he lives, Sophie. We came, said Sophie weakly. Can we see the house? I'm afraid that's our dog. No, 'tis Rumbler, said the old man. He's been at my swill pail again. Staying at Rocket's, be ye? Come in. Ah, you run a gate. The hound broke from him, and he tottered after him down the drive. They entered the hall, just such a high-light hall as such a house should own. A slim balustered staircase, wide and shallow, and once creamy white, climbed out of it under a long oval window. On either side, delicately moulded doors gave on to wool-lumbered rooms, whose sea-green mantelpieces were adorned with nymphs, scrolls, and cupids in low relief. "What's the firm that makes these things?" cried Sophie enraptured. "Oh, I forgot. This must be the originals. Adams, is it? I never dreamed of anything like that steel-cut fender. Does he mean us to go everywhere?" "He's catching the dog," said George, looking out. "We don't count." They explored the first or ground floor, delighted as children playing burglars. "This is like all England," she said at last. "Wonderful, but no explanation. You're expected to know it beforehand. Now let's try upstairs." The stairs never creaked beneath their feet. From the broad landing they entered a long, green-panelled room, lighted by 3 full-length windows, which overlooked the forlorn wreck of a terraced garden and wooded slopes beyond. "The drawing-room, of course." Sophie swam up and down it. "That mantelpiece, Orpheus and Eurydice, is the best of them all. Isn't it marvellous? Why, the room seems furnished with nothing in it. How's that, George?" "It's the proportions. I've noticed it." "I saw a Hepplewhite couch once," Sophie said, her finger to her flushed cheek, and considered. "With 2 of them, one on each side, you wouldn't need anything else, except there must be one perfect mirror over the mantelpiece." "Look at that view. It's a framed constable," her husband cried. "No, it's a moorland, a parody of a moorland. But about that couch, George, don't you think Empire might be better than Hepplewhite? Dull gold against the pale green. It's a pity they don't make spinets nowadays." "I believe you can get them. Look at that oak wood behind the pines." "While you sat and played toccatas stately at the clavichord," Sophie hummed, and, head on one side, nodded to where the perfect mirror should hang. Then they found bedrooms, with dressing-rooms and powdering closets, and steps leading up and down, boxes of rooms, round, square, and octagonal, with enriched ceilings and chased door-locks. Now about servants. Oh! She had darted up the last stairs to the checkered darkness of the top floor, where loose tiles lay among broken laths, and the walls were scrawled with names, sentiments, and hop records. "They've been keeping pigeons here," she cried. "And you could drive a buggy through the roof anywhere," said George. "That's what I say," the old man cried below them on the stairs. "Not a dry place for my pigeons at all." "But why was it allowed to get like this?" said Sophie. "'Tis with housen as 'tith," he replied. "Let 'em go too far, and there's nothing to be done. Time was they was minded to sell her, but none would buy. She was too far away along from any place. Time was they had lived here theyselves, but they took and died." "Here?" Sophie moved beneath the light of a hole in the roof. "Nah, None dies here except falling off ricks and such. In London they died." He plucked a lock of wool from his blue smock. "There was no staple, neither the Elphics nor the Moons. Short and brittle all of them. Dead they be 17 year, for I've been here caretaking 25. "Who does all the wool belong to downstairs?" George asked. "To the estate. I'll show you the back parts if you like. You're from America, ain't ye? I've had a son there once myself." They followed him down the main stairway. He paused at the turn and swept one hand towards the wall. "Plenty room here for your coffin to come down. 7 foot and 3 men at each end wouldn't breach the paint. If I die in my bed, they'll have to up-end me like a milk can. 'Tis all luck, d'ye see?" He led them on and on through a maze of back kitchens, dairies, larders, and sculleries, that melted along covered ways into a farmhouse, visibly older than the main building, which again rambled out among barns, byres, pig pens, stalls, and stables to the dead fields behind. "Somehow," said Sophie, sitting exhausted on an ancient well-curb, "somehow one wouldn't insult these lovely old things by filling them with hay." George looked at long stone walls upholding reaches of silvery oak, weather-boarding, buttresses of mixed flint and bricks, outside stairs, stone upon arched stone, curves of thatch where grass sprouted, roundels of house-licked tiles, and a huge paved yard populated by 2 cows and the repentant rambler. He had not thought of himself or of the telegraph office for 2½ hours. "But why," said Sophie, as they went back through the crater of stricken fields, "why is one expected to know everything in England? Why do they never tell?" "You mean about the Elphics and the Moons?" he answered. "Yes, and the lawyers and the estate. Who are they? I wonder whether those painted floors in the green room were real oak. Don't you like us exploring things together, better than Pompeii?" George turned once more to look at the view. 800 acres go with the house, the old man told me. 5 farms altogether. Rocket's is one of them. "I like Mrs. Cloak, but what is the old house called?" George laughed. "That's one of the things you're expected to know. He never told me." The Cloaks were more communicative. That evening, and thereafter for a week, they gave the Chapins the official history, as one gives it to lodgers, of Friar's Pardon, the house, and its 5 farms. But Sophie asked so many questions, and George was so humanly interested, that, as confidence in the strangers grew, they launched, with observed and acquired detail, into the lives and deaths and doings of the Elphics and the Moons, and their collaterals, the Halings and the Torrals. It was a tale told serially by Cloak in the barn or his wife in the dairy, the last chapters reserved for the kitchen o' nights by the big fire, when the two had been half the day exploring about the house, where old Eagledon of the blue smock cackled and chuckled to see them. The motives that swayed the characters were beyond their comprehension. The fates that shifted them were gods they had never met. The sidelights Mrs. Cloak threw on act and incident were more amazing than anything in the record. Therefore the Chapins listened delightedly and blessed Mrs. Shonts. "But why did so-and-so do so-and-so?" Sophie would demand from her seat by the pot-hook, and Mrs. Cloak would answer, smoothing her knees, "For the sake of the place." "I give it up," said George one night in their own room. "People don't seem to matter in this country compared to the places they live in. The way she tells it, Friar's Pardon was a sort of Moloch." "Poor old thing!" They had been walking round the farms as usual before tea. "No wonder they loved it. Think of the sacrifices they made for it. Jane Elphick married the younger Torrell to keep it in the family. The octagonal room with the moulded ceiling next to the big bedroom was hers. Now what did he tell you while he was feeding the pigs?" said Sophie. "About the Torrell cousins and the uncle who died in Java. They lived at Burnt House, behind High Pardons, where that brook is all blocked up." "No, Burnt House is under High Pardons Wood before you come to Gale Unstey," Sophie corrected. "Well, old man Cloak said—" Sophie threw open the door and called down into the kitchen, where the Cloaks were covering the fire. "Mrs. Cloak, isn't Burnt House under High Pardons?" "Yes, my dear, of course." The soft voice answered absently. A cough. "I beg your pardon, madam? What was it you said?" "Never mind, I prefer it the other way." Sophie laughed, and George retold the missing chapter as she sat on the bed. "Here today and gone tomorrow," said Cloak warningly. "They've paid their first month, but we've only that Mrs. Shon's letter for guarantee. None she sent never cheated us yet. It slipped out before I thought. She's a most humane young lady. They'll be going away in a little. And you've talked a lot too, Alfred." "Yes, but the Elphics are all dead. No one can bring my loose talking home to me. But why do they stay on and stay on so?" In due time George and Sophie asked each other that question and put it aside. They argued that the climate, a pearly blend, unlike the hot and cold ferocities of their own native land, suited them as the thick stillness of the night certainly suited George. He was saved even the sight of a metalled road, which, as presumably leading to business, wakes desire in a man, and the telegraph office at the village of Friar's Pardon, where they sold picture postcards and peg tops, was 2 walking miles across the fields and woods. For all that touched his past among his fellows, on their remembrance of him, he might have been in another planet, and Sophie, whose life had been very largely spent among husbandless wives of lofty ideals, had no wish to leave this present of God. The unhurried meals, the foreknowledge of deliciously empty hours to follow, the breadths of soft sky under which they walked together and reckoned time only by their hunger or thirst, the good grass beneath their feet that cheated the miles, their discoveries always together amid the farms, Griffins, Rockets, Burnt House, Gale Anstey, and the Home Farm, where Eagledon of the blue smock-frock would waylay them, and they would ransack the old house once more, the long wet afternoons when they tucked up their feet on the bedroom's deep window-sill over against the apple-trees and talked together as never till then had they found time to talk. These things contented her soul, and her body throve. "Have you realized," she asked one morning, "that we've been here absolutely alone for the last 34 days?" "Have you counted them?" he asked. "Did you like them?" she replied. "I must have. I didn't think about them. Yes, I have. 6 months ago I should have fretted myself sick. Remember at Cairo? I've only had 2 or 3 bad times. Am I getting better, or is it senile decay?" "Climate, all climate." Sophie swung her new-bought English boots as she sat on the stile overlooking Friar's Pardon, behind the Cloaks' barn. "One must take hold of things, though," he said, "if it's only to keep one's hand in." His eyes did not flicker now as they swept the empty fields. "Mustn't one?" "Lay out a Morristown links over Gale Anstey. I dare say you could hire it." "No, I'm not as English as that, nor as Morristown. Clock says all the farms here could be made to pay." "Well, I'm Anastasia in the Treasure of Frankfurt. I'm content to be alive and purr. There's no hurry." "No," he smiled. "All the same, I'm going to see after my mail." "You promised you wouldn't have any." "There's some business coming through that's amusing me. Honest, it doesn't get on my nerves at all." "Want a secretary?" "No, thanks, old thing. Isn't that quite English?" "Too English." "Go away." But none the less, in broad daylight, she returned the kiss. "I'm off to Pardon's. I haven't been to the house for nearly a week." "How have you decided to furnish Jane Elphick's bedroom?" He laughed, for it had come to be a permanent castle in Spain between them. "Black Chinese furniture and yellow silk brocade," she answered, and ran downhill. She scattered a few cows at a gap with a flourish of a ground ash that Eagledon had cut for her a week ago, and singing as she passed under the holm oaks, sought the farmhouse at the back of Friar's Pardon. The old man was not to be found, and she knocked at his half-open door, for she needed him to fill her idle forenoon. A blue-eyed sheep-dog, a new friend and Rambler's old enemy, crawled out and besought her to enter. Eagledon sat in his chair by the fire, a thistle-spud between his knees, his head drooped. Though she had never seen death before, her heart, that missed a bit, told her that he was dead. She did not speak or cry, but stood outside the door, and the dog licked her hand. When he threw up his nose, she heard herself saying, "Don't howl. Please don't begin to howl, Scotty. or I shall run away." She held her ground while the shadows in the rickyard moved toward noon, sat after a while on the steps by the door, her arms round the dog's neck, waiting till someone should come. She watched the smokeless chimneys of Friar's Pardon slush its roofs with shadow, and the smoke of Iggulden's last lighted fire gradually thin and cease. Against her will she fell to wondering how many moons, Elphics and Torals had been swung around the turn of the broad hall stairs. Then she remembered the old man's talk of being upended like a milk-can, and buried her face in Scotty's neck. At last a horse's feet clinked upon flags, rustled in the old grey straw of the rickyard, and she found herself facing the vicar, a figure she had seen at church declaiming impossibilities. Sophie was a Unitarian, in an unnatural voice. "He's dead," she said without preface. "Old Iggulden? I was coming for a talk with him." The vicar passed in uncovered. "Ah," she heard him say, "heart failure. How long have you been here?" "Since 11:15. She looked at her watch earnestly and saw that her hand did not shake. "I'll sit with him now till the doctor comes. Do you think you could tell him, and yes, Mrs. Betts in the cottage with the wisteria next the blacksmith's? I'm afraid this has been rather a shock to you." Sophie nodded and fled toward the village. Her body failed her for a moment. She dropped beneath a hedge and looked back at the great house. In some fashion its silence and stolidity steadied her for her errand. Mrs. Betts, small, black-eyed, and dark, was almost as unconcerned as Friar's Pardon. "Yes, yes, of course, dear me. Well, Iggulden, he had had his day in my father's time. Muriel, get me my little blue bag, please." "Yes, ma'am. They come down like elm branches in still weather. No warning at all. Muriel, my bicycle's behind the fowl house. I'll tell Dr. Dallas, ma'am." She trundled off on her wheel like a brown bee, while Sophie, heaven above and earth beneath changed, walked stiffly home, to fall over George at his letters in a muddle of laughter and tears. "It's all quite natural for them," she gasped. "They come down like elm branches in still weather. Yes, ma'am. No, there wasn't anything in the least horrible, only, oh, George, that poor shiny stick of his between his poor thin knees. I couldn't have borne it if Scotty had howled. I didn't know the vicar was so sensitive. He said he was afraid it was rather a shock. Mrs. Betts told me to go home, and I wanted to collapse on her floor, but I didn't disgrace myself. I couldn't have left him, could I?" "You're sure you've taken no harm?" cried Mrs. Cloak, who had heard the news by farm telegraphy, which is older but swifter than Marconi's. "No, I'm perfectly well," Sophie protested. "You lay down till tea time." Mrs. Cloak patted her shoulder. "They'll be very pleased, though she has had no proper understanding for 20 years. "They" came before twilight, a black-bearded man in moleskins and a little palsied old woman, who chirruped like a wren. "I'm his son," said the man to Sophie among the lavender bushes. "We had a difference 20 year back, and didn't speak since. But I'm his son all the same, and we thank you for the watching." "I'm only glad I happened to be there," she answered, and from the bottom of her heart she meant it. "We heard he spoke a lot of you, one time and another since you came. We thank you kindly," the man added. "Are you the son that was in America?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. On my uncle's farm in Connecticut. He was what they call roadmaster there." "Whereabouts in Connecticut?" asked George over her shoulder. "Veering Holler was the name. I was there 6 years with my uncle." "How small the world is!" Sophie cried. "Why, all my mother's people come from Veering Hollow. There must be some there still. The Lashmars, did you ever hear of them?" "I remember hearing that name, seems to me," he answered, but his face was blank as the back of a spade. A little before dusk, a woman in grey, striding like a foot soldier and bearing on her arm a long pole, crashed through the orchard calling for food. George, upon whom the unannounced English worked mysteriously, fled to the parlour, but Mrs. Cloak came forward beaming. Sophie could not escape. "We've only just heard of it," said the stranger, turning on her. "I've been out with the otter hounds all day. It was a splendidly sporting thing." "Did you, kill?" said Sophie. She knew from books she could not go far wrong here. "Yes, a dry bitch, 17 pounds," was the answer. "A splendidly sporting thing of you to do. Poor old Eagledon." "Oh, that!" said Sophie, enlightened. "If there had been any people at Pardon's, it would never have happened. He'd have been looked after. But what can you expect from a parcel of London solicitors?" Mrs. Cloak murmured something. "No, I'm soaked from the knees down. If I hang about, I shall get chilled. A cup of tea, Mrs. Cloak, and I can eat one of your sandwiches as I go." She wiped her weather-worn face with a green and yellow silk handkerchief. "Yes, my lady." Mrs. Cloak ran and returned swiftly. "Our land marches with Pardons for a mile on the south," she explained, waving the full cup, "but one has quite enough to do with one's own people without poaching. Still, if I'd known, I'd have sent Dora, of course. Have you seen her this afternoon, Mrs. Cloak? No? I wonder whether that girl did sprain her ankle. Thank you." It was a formidable hunk of bread and bacon that Mrs. Cloak presented. "As I was saying, Pardons is a scandal. Letting people die like dogs. There ought to be people there who do their duty. You've done yours, though there wasn't the faintest call upon you. Good night. Tell Dora if she comes I've gone on." She strode away, munching her crust, and Sophie reeled breathless into the parlour to shake the shaking George. "Why did you keep catching my eye behind the blind? Why didn't you come out and do your duty?" "Because I should have burst. Did you see the mud on its cheek?" he said. "Once. I daren't look again. Who is she?" "God. A local deity, then. Anyway, she's another of the things you're expected to know by instinct." Mrs. Cloak, shocked at their levity, told them that it was Lady Conant, wife of Sir Walter Conant, Baronet, a large landholder in the neighbourhood, and if not God, at least his visible providence. George made her talk of that family for an hour. "Laughter," said Sophie afterward in their own room, "is the mark of the savage. Why couldn't you control your emotions?" "It's all real to her." "It's all real to me. That's my trouble," he answered in an altered tone. "Anyway, it's real enough to mark time with. Don't you think so?" "What do you mean?" she asked quickly, though she knew his voice. "That I'm better. I'm well enough to kick." "What at? This?" He waved his hand around the one room. "I must have something to play with till I'm fit for work again." "Oh!" She sat on the bed and leaned forward, her hands clasped. "I wonder if it's good for you." "We've been better here than anywhere," he went on slowly. "One could always sell it again." She nodded gravely, but her eyes sparkled. "The only thing that worries me is what happened this morning. I want to know how you feel about it. If it's on your nerves in the least, we can have the old farm at the back of the house pulled down, or perhaps it has spoiled the notion for you." "Pull it down?" she cried. "You've no business faculty. Why, that's where we could live while we're putting the big house in order. It's almost under the same roof. No, what happened this morning seemed to be more of a leading than anything else. There ought to be people at Pardon's. Lady Conan's quite right. I was thinking more of the woods and the roads. I could double the value of the place in 6 months." "What do they want for it?" She shook her head, and her loosened hair fell glowingly about her cheeks. $75,000. They'll take 68. Less than half what we paid for our old yacht when we married. And we didn't have a good time in her. You were Well, I discovered I was too much of an American to be content to be a rich man's son. You aren't blaming me for that?" "Oh, no. Only it was a very businesslike honeymoon. How far are you along with the deal, George?" "I can mail the deposit on the purchase money to-morrow morning, and we can have the thing completed in a fortnight or 3 weeks, if you say so." "Friar's pardon, friar's pardon," Sophie chanted rapturously, her dark grey eyes big with delight. "All the farms? Gale, Ansley, Burnt House, Rockets, the Home Farm, and Griffin's? Sure you've got 'em all?" "Sure," he smiled. "And the Woods, High Pardon's Wood, Lower Pardon's, Sutton's, Dutton's Shaw, Rubens Gill, Max's Gill, and both the oak hangers? Sure you've got 'em all?" "Every last stick. Why, you know them as well as I do. He laughed. "They say there's 5,000, £1,000 worth of lumber, timber they call it, in the hangars alone. Mrs. Cloak's oven must be mended first thing, and the kitchen roof. I think I'll have all this whitewashed," Sophie broke in, pointing to the ceiling. "The whole place is a scandal. Lady Conant is quite right. George, when did you begin to fall in love with the house? In the green room, that first day? I did." "I'm not in love with it. One must do something to mark time till one's fit for work. Or when we stood under the oaks and the door opened. Oh, ought I to go to poor Eggleton's funeral?" She sighed with utter happiness. "Wouldn't they call it a liberty, now?" said he. "But I liked him." "But you didn't own him at the date of his death." "That wouldn't keep me away, only they made such a fuss about the watching." She caught her breath. "It might be ostentatious from that point of view, too. Oh, George!" She reached for his hand. "We're two little orphans moving in worlds not realized, and we shall make some bad breaks, but we're going to have the time of our lives. We'll run up to London to-morrow and see if we can hurry those English law solicitors. I want to get to work." They went. They suffered many things ere they returned across the fields in a fly one Saturday night, nursing a 2 by 2.5 box of deeds and maps, lawful owners of Friar's Pardon and the 5 decayed farms therewith. "I do most sincerely hope and trust you'll be happy, madam," Mrs. Cloak gasped, when she was told the news by the kitchen fire. "Goodness, it isn't a marriage!" Sophie exclaimed, a little awed, for to them the joke, which to an American means work, was only just beginning. "If it's took in a proper spirit," Mrs. Cloak's eye turned toward her oven. "Send and have that mended to-morrow," Sophie whispered. "We couldn't help noticing," said Cloak slowly, "from the times you walked there, that you and your lady was drawn to it, but I don't know as we ever precisely thought—" His wife's glance checked him. "That we were that sort of people?" said George. "We aren't sure of it ourselves yet." "Perhaps," said Cloak, rubbing his knees, just for the sake of saying something, "perhaps you'll park it?" "What's that?" said George. "Turn it all into a fine park like Violet Hill." He jerked a thumb to westward. "That Mr. Sangra's bought. It was 4 farms, and Mr. Sangra's made a fine park of them, with a herd of fallen deer." "Then it wouldn't be Friar's Pardon," said Sophie, "would it?" "I don't know as I've ever heard pardons was ever anything but wheat and wool. Only some gentlemen say that parks are less trouble than tenants." He laughed nervously. "But the gentry, of course, they keep on pretty much as they was used to." "I see," said Sophie. "How did Mr. Sangra's make his money?" "I never rightly heard. It was pepper and spices, or it may ha' been gloves. No, gloves was Sir Reginald Lee's at Marley End. Spices was Mr. Sangra's. He's a Brazilian gentleman, very sunburnt like." "Be sure of one thing, you won't have any trouble," said Mrs. Cloak, just before they went to bed. Now the news of the purchase was told to Mr. and Mrs. Cloak alone at 8 p.m. of a Saturday. None left the farm till they set out for church next morning. Yet when they reached the church and were about to slip aside into their usual seats, a little beyond the font, where they could see the red furred tails of the red robes woggle and twist at ringing time, they were swept forward irresistibly, a cloak on either flank, and yet they had not walked with the cloaks, upon the ever retiring bosom of a black-gowned verger, who ushered them into a room of a pew at the head of the left aisle, under the pulpit. "This," he sighed reproachfully, "is the pardon's pew," and shut them in. They could see little more than the choir boys in the chancel, but to the roots of the hair of their necks they felt the congregation behind mercilessly devouring them by look. "When the wicked man turneth away," the strong alien voice of the priest vibrated under the hammer-beam roof, and a loneliness unfelt before swamped their hearts as they searched for places in the unfamiliar Church of England service. The Lord's Prayer, "Our Father which art," set the seal on that desolation. Sophie found herself thinking how, in other lands, their purchase would long ere this have been discussed from every point of view in a dozen prints, forgetting that George for months had not been allowed to glance at those black and bellowing headlines. Here was nothing but silence, not even hostility. The game was up to them. The other players hid their cards and waited. Suspense, she felt, was in the air, and when her sight cleared, she saw indeed a mural tablet of a footless bird brooding upon the caravan motto, "Wait a while, wait a while." At the litany George had trouble with an unstable hassock, and drew the slip of carpet under the pew seat. Sophie pushed her end back also, and shut her eyes against a burning that felt like tears. When she opened them she was looking at her mother's maiden name, fairly carved on a blue flag stone on the pew floor. Ellen Lashmar died in 1796, at the age of 27. She nudged George and pointed. Sheltered as they kneeled, they looked for more knowledge, but the rest of the slab was blank. "Ever hear of her?" he whispered. "Never knew any of us came from here. Coincidence? Perhaps, but it makes me feel better." And she smiled and winked away a tear on her lashes, and took his hand while they prayed for all women labouring of child, not in the perils of childbirth. And the sparrows, who had found their way through the guards behind the glass windows, chirped above the faded gilt and alabaster family tree of the Conants. The baronet's pew was on the right of the aisle. After service its inhabitants moved forth without haste, but so as to block effectively a dusky person with a large family who chomped in the rear. "Spices, I think," said Sophie, deeply delighted as the sanguis closed up after the Conants. "Let them get away, George." But when they came out, many folk whose eyes were one still lingered by the lych gate. "I want to see if any more Lashmars are buried here," said Sophie. "Not now. This seems to be show day. Come home quickly," he replied. A group of families, the cloaks a little apart, opened to let them through. The men saluted with jerky nods, the women with remnants of a curtsy. Only Eagledon's son, his mother on his arm, lifted his hat as Sophie passed. "Your people," said the clear voice of Lady Conant in her ear. "I suppose so," said Sophie, blushing, for they were within 2 yards of her, but it was not a question. "Then that child looks as if it were coming down with mumps. You ought to tell the mother she shouldn't have brought it to church." "I can't leave her behind, my lady," the woman said. "She'd set the house afire in a minute. She's that forward with the matches. And you, Maudie, dear?" "Has Dr. Dallas seen her?" "Not yet, my lady." "He must. You can't get away, of course." My idiotic maid is coming in for her teeth tomorrow at 12. She shall pick her up at Gale Anstey, isn't it? At 11. Yes, thank you very much, my lady." "I oughtn't to have done it," said Lady Conant apologetically, "but there has been no one at Pardon's for so long that you'll forgive my poaching. Now, can't you lunch with us? The vicar usually comes too. I don't use the horses on a Sunday." She glanced at the Brazilian silver-plated chariot. "It's only a mile across the fields." You're very kind," said Sophie, hating herself because her lip trembled. "My dear," the compelling tone dropped to a soothing gurgle, "do you suppose I don't know how it feels to come to a strange country, I should say, away from one's own people? When I first left the Shires, I'm Shropshire, you know, I cried for a day and a night. But fretting doesn't make loneliness any better. Oh, here's Dora. She did sprain her leg that day." "I'm as lame as a tree still," said the tall maiden frankly. "You ought to go out with the otter hounds, Mrs. Chapin. I believe they're drawing your water next week." Sir Walter had already led off George, and the vicar came up on the other side of Sophie. There was no escaping the swift procession or the leisurely lunch, where talk came and went in low-voiced eddies that had the village for their centre. Sophie heard the vicar and Sir Walter address her husband lightly as Chapin. She also remembered many women known in a previous life who habitually addressed their husbands as Mr. Such-an-one. After lunch, Lady Conant talked to her explicitly of maternity, as that is achieved in cottages and farmhouses remote from aid, and of the duty thereto of the mistress of Pardons. A gate in a beech hedge, reached across triple lawns, let them out before tea time into the unkept south side of the land. "I want your hand, please," said Sophie as soon as they were safe among the beech boles and the lawless hollies. "Do you remember the old maid in Providence and the guitar? who heard the commissary swear, and hardly reckoned herself a maiden lady afterwards? Because I'm a relative of hers. Lady Conant is—" "Did you find out anything about the Lashmars?" he interrupted. "I didn't ask. I'm going to write to Aunt Sydney about it first." "Oh, Lady Conant said something at lunch about their having bought some land from some Lashmars a few years ago. I found it was at the beginning of last century." "What did you say?" "I said, 'Really, how interesting.' Like that. I'm not going to push myself forward. I've been hearing about Mrs. Sancris's effort in that direction. And you? I couldn't see you behind the flowers. Was it very deep waters, dear?" George mopped a brow already browned by outdoor exposures. "Oh, no, dead easy," he answered. "I've bought Friar's pardon to prevent Sir Walter's bird straying." A cock pheasant scattered through the dry leaves and exploded almost under their feet. Sophie jumped. "That's one of them," said George calmly. "Well, your nerves are better at any rate," said she. "Did you tell him you'd bought the thing to play with?" "No, that was where my nerve broke down. I only made one bad break, I think. I said I couldn't see why hiring land to men to farm wasn't as much a business proposition as anything else." "And what did they say?" "They smiled. I shall know what that smile means some day. They don't waste their smiles. Do you see that truck by Galansti?" They looked down from the edge of the hangar over a cup-like hollow. People by twos and threes in their Sunday best filed slowly along the paths that connected farm to farm. "I've never seen so many on our land before," said Sophie. "Why is it?" "To show us we mustn't shut up their rights of way." "Those cow tracks we've been using cross lots?" said Sophie forcibly. "Yes. Any one of them would cost us £2,000 each in legal expenses to close. But we don't want to," she said. "The whole community would fight if we did. But it's our land. We can do what we like." "It's not our land. We've only paid for it. We belong to it, and it belongs to the people. Our people, they call them. I've been to lunch with the English too." They passed slowly from one bracken-dotted field to the next, flushed with pride of ownership, plotting alterations and restorations at each turn, halting in their tracks to argue, spreading apart to embrace two views at once, or closing in to consider one. Couples moved out of their way, but smiling covertly. "We shall make some bad breaks," he said at last. "Together, though. You won't let any one else in, will you?" "Except the contractors. The syndicate handles this proposition by its little loan." "But you might feel the want of someone," she insisted. "I shall, but it will be you. It's business, Sophie, but it's going to be good fun." "Please God," she answered, flushing, and cried to herself as they went back to tea. "It's worth it. Oh, it's worth it." The repairing and moving in Friar's pardon was business of the most varied and searching, but all done English fashion, without friction. Time and money alone were asked. The rest lay in the hands of beneficent advisers from London, or spirits, male and female, called up by Mr. and Mrs. Cloak from the wastes of their farms. In the centre stood George and Sophie, a little aghast, their interests reaching out on every side. "I ain't saying anything against Londoners," said Cloak, self-appointed clerk of the outer works, consulting engineer, head of the Immigration Bureau, and superintendent of woods and forests. "But your own people won't go about to make more than a fair profit out of you." "How is one to know?" said George. 5 years from now, or so on, maybe, you'll be looking over your first year's accounts, and, knowing what you'll know then, you'll say, 'Well, Billy Beartap, or old Cloak as it might be, did me proper when I was new.' No man likes to have that sort of thing laid up against him." "I think I see," said George, "but 5 years is a long time to look ahead." "I doubt if that oak Billy Beartap throwed in Reuben's gill will be fit for her drawing-room floor in less than 7," Cloak drawled. "Yes, that's my work," said Sophie. Billy Beartap of Griffin's, a woodman by training and birth, a tenant farmer by misfortune of marriage, had laid his broad axe at her feet a month before. "Sorry if I've committed you to another eternity." "And we shan't ever know where we've gone wrong with your new carriage drive before that time either," said Cloak, ever anxious to keep the balance true, with an ounce or two in Sophie's favour. The past 4 months had taught George better than to reply. The carriage road winding up the hill was his present keen interest. They set off to look at it, and the imported American scraper which had blighted the none too sunny soul of Skim Winch the carter. But young Eagledon was in charge now, and under his guidance Buller and Roberts, the great horses, moved mountains. "You lift her like that, and you tip her like that," he explained to the gang. "My uncle, he was roadmaster in Connecticut." "Are they roads yonder?" said Skim, sitting under the laurels. "No better than accommodation roads. Dirt, they call 'em. They'd suit you, Skim." "Why?" said the incautious Skim. "'Cause you take no hurt when you fall out of your cart drunk on a Saturday," was the answer. "I didn't last time, neither," Skim roared. After the loud laugh, old Wyburn of Gale Anstey piped feebly. "Well, dirt or no dirt, there's no denying Chappie knows a good job when he sees it. He don't build one day and destroy the next, like that nigger Sangress." "She's the one that knows her own mind," said Pinky, brother to Skim Winch, and a Napoleon among carters, who had helped to bring the grand piano across the fields in the autumn rains. "She had ought to," said Eagledon. "Whoa, Buller! She's a Lashmar. They never was double thinking." "Whoa, you found that? Has the answer come from your uncle?" said Skim, doubtful whether so remote a land as America had posts. The others looked at him scornfully. Skim was always a day behind the fair. Eagledon rested from his labours. "She's a Lashmar right enough. I started up to write to my uncle at once, the month after she said her folks came from Veering Holler." "Where there ain't any roads?" Skim interrupted, but none laughed. "My uncle, he married an American woman for his second, and she took it up like the coroner. She's a Lashmar out of the old Lashmar place, 'fore they sold to Conants. She ain't no Toot Hill Lashmar, nor any of the Crayford lot. Her folk come out of the ground here, neither chalk nor forest, but Wiltshires. They sailed over to America. I've got it all writ down by my uncle's woman, in 1800 and nothing. My uncle says they're all slow begetters like." "Would they be gentry yonder now?" Skim asked. "Nah, there's no gentry in America. No matter how long you're there, it's against their law. There's only rich and poor allowed. They've been lawyers and such like over yonder for 100 years. But she's a Lashmar for all that." "Lord, what's 100 years?" said Wyburn, who had seen 78 of them. "And they ride too, from yonder. My uncle's woman rides, that you can still tell 'em by a head mark. Their hair's foxy red still, and they throw out when they walk. He's in-toed, treads like a gypsy, but you watch, and you'll see her throw out, like a colt. Your trace wants taking up." Pinky's large ears had caught the sound of voices, and as the two broke through the laurels, the men were hard at work, their eyes on Sophie's feet. She had been less fortunate in her inquiries than Eagledon, for her Aunt Sydney of Meriden, a badged and certificated daughter of the Revolution to boot, answered her inquiries with a 2-page discourse on patriotism, the leaflets of a village improvement society, of which she was president, and a demand for an overdue subscription to a factory girls' reading circle. Sophie burned it all in the Orpheus and Eurydice crate, and kept her own counsel. "What I want to know," said George, when spring was coming, and the gardens needed thought, "is who will ever pay me for my labour? I've put in at least $500,000 worth already." "Sure you're not taking too much out of yourself?" his wife asked. "Oh, no, I haven't been conscious of myself all winter." He looked at his brown English gaiters and smiled. "It's all behind me now. I believe I could sit down and think of all that, those months before we sailed." "Don't, oh, don't!" she cried. "But I must go back one day. You don't want to keep me out of business always, or do you?" he ended with a nervous laugh. Sophie sighed as she drew her own ground ash, of old Eagledon's cutting, from the hall rack. "Aren't you overdoing it too? You look a little tired," he said. "You make me tired. I'm going to Rocket's to see Mrs. Cloak about Mary." This was the sister of the telegraphist, promoted to be sewing maid at Pardon's. "Coming?" "I'm due at Burn House to see about the new well. By the way, there's a sore throat at Gale Anstey." "That's my province. Don't interfere. The Wyburn children always have sore throats. They do it for jujubes. Keep away from Gail Unstey till I make sure, honey. Cloak ought to have told me. These people don't tell. Haven't you learned that yet? But I'll obey, my lord. See you later. She set off afoot, for within the 3 main roads that bounded the blunt triangle of the estate, even by night one could scarcely hear the carts on them. Wheels were not used except for farm work. The footpath served all other purposes, and, though at first they had planned improvements, they had soon fallen in with the customs of their hidden kingdom, and moved about the soft-footed ways by woodland, hedgerow, and shaw as freely as the rabbits. Indeed, for the most part Sophie walked bareheaded beneath her helmet of chestnut hair, but she had been plagued of late by vague toothaches, which she explained to Mrs. Cloak, who asked some questions. How it came about Sophie never knew, but after a while, behold, Mrs. Cloak's arm was about her waist, and her head was on that deep bosom behind the shut kitchen door. "My dear, my dear!" the elder woman almost sobbed. "And you mean to tell me you never suspicioned? Why, where was you ever taught anything at all? Of course it is. It's what we've been only waiting for, all of us. Time and again I've said to Lady—" She checked herself. "And now we shall be as we should be." But, Sophie whimpered, "and to see you building your nest so busy, pianos and books, and never thinking of a nursery." "No more I did." Sophie sat bolt upright and began to laugh. "Time enough yet." The fingers tapped thoughtfully on the broad knee. "But they must be strange-minded folk over yonder with you. Have you thought to send for your mother?" "She dead? My dear, never mind, she'll be happy where she knows. 'Tis God's work, and we was only waiting for it, for you've never failed in your duty yet. It ain't your way. What did you say about my Mary's doings?" Mrs. Cloak's face hardened as she pressed her chin on Sophie's forehead. "If any of your girls thinks to behave arbitrary now, But they won't, my dear. I'll see they do their duty too. Be sure you'll have no trouble." When Sophie walked back across the fields, heaven and earth changed about her as on the day of old Eagledon's death. For an instant she thought of the wide turn of the staircase and the new ivory-white pane that no coffin corner could scar, but presently the shadow passed in a pure wonder and bewilderment that made her reel. She leaned against one of their new gates and looked over their lands for some other stay. "Well," she said resignedly, half aloud, "we must try to make him feel that he isn't a third in our party," and turned the corner that looked over Friar's Pardon, giddy, sick, and faint. Of a sudden the house they had bought for a whim stood up as she had never seen it before, low-fronted, broad-winged, ample, prepared by course of generations for all such things. As it had steadied her when it lay desolate, so now that it had meaning from their few months of life within, it soothed and promised good. She went alone and quickly into the hall, and kissed either door-post, whispering, "Be good to me. You know, you've never failed in your duty yet." When the matter was explained to George, he would have sailed at once to their own land, but this Sophie forbade. "I don't want science," she said. "I just want to be loved, and there isn't time for that at home. Besides," she added, looking out of the window, "it would be desertion." George was forced to soothe himself with linking Friar Pardon to the telegraph system of Great Britain by telephone, 3/4 of a mile of poles put in by Wyburn and a few friends. One of these was a foreigner from the next parish. Said he, when the line was being run, "There's an old Elam right in our road. Shall I throw her?" "Toot Hill parish folk, neither grace nor good luck. God help 'em." Old Wyburn shouted the local proverb from 3 poles down the line. "We ain't going to lay any axe iron to coffin wood here. Not till we know where we are yet a while. Swing round her, swing round." To this day, then, that sudden kink in the straight line across the upper pasture remains a mystery to Sophie and George. Nor can they tell why Skim Winch, who came to his cottage under Dutton Shaw most musically drunk at 10:45 p.m. of every Saturday night, as his father had done before him, sang no more, at the bottom of the garden steps, where Sophie always feared he would break his neck. The path was undoubtedly an ancient right of way, and at 10:45 p.m. on Saturdays Skim remembered it was his duty to posterity to keep it open. Till Mrs. Cloak spoke to him once. She spoke likewise to her daughter Mary, sewing maid at Pardon's, and to Mary's new friend, the 5'7" imported London housemaid, who taught Mary to trim hats and found the county dullish. But there was no noise. At no time was there any noise, and when Sophie walked abroad, she met no one in her path unless she had signified a wish that way. Then they appeared to protest that all was well with them and their children, their chickens, their roofs, their water supply, and their sons in the police or the railway service. "But don't you find it dull, dear?" said George, loyally doing his best not to worry as the months went by. "I've been so busy putting my house in order, I haven't had time to think," said she. "Do you?" "No, no. If I could only be sure of you." She turned on the green drawing-room's couch, it was Empire, not Applewhite after all, and laid aside a list of linen and blankets. "It has changed everything, hasn't it?" she whispered. "Oh Lord, yes. But I still think if we went back to Baltimore and missed our first real summer together, no, thank you, my lord. But we're absolutely alone. Isn't that what I'm doing my best to remedy?" "Don't you worry. I like it to the marrow of my little bones. You don't realize what her house means to a woman. We thought we were living in it last year, but we hadn't begun to. Don't you rejoice in your study, George? I prefer being here with you." He sat down on the floor by the couch and took her hand. "7," she said, as the French clock struck. "Year before last you'd just be coming back from business." He winced at the recollection, then laughed. "Business! I've been at work 10 solid hours today." "Where did you lunch? With the Conants?" "No, at Duttonshaw, sitting on a log, with my feet in a swamp. But we found out where the old spring is, and we're going to pipe it down to Galansty next year. I'll come and see to-morrow. Oh, please open the door, dear. I want to look down the passage. Isn't that corner by the stair-head lovely, where the sun strikes in?" She looked through half-closed eyes at the vista of ivory white and pale green, all steeped in liquid gold. "There's a step out of Jane Elphick's bedroom," she went on, "and his first step in the world ought to be up. I shouldn't wonder if those people hadn't put it there on purpose. George, will it make any odds to you if he's a girl?" He answered, as he had many times before, that his interest was his wife, not the child. "Then you're the only person who thinks so," she laughed. "Don't be silly, dear. It's expected, I know. It's my duty. I shan't be able to look our people in the face if I fail." "What concern is it of theirs, confound 'em?" "You'll see. Luckily, the tradition of the house is boys, Mrs. Cloak says, so I'm provided for. Shall you ever begin to understand these people? I shan't. And we bought it for fun. For fun!" he groaned. "And here we are held up for goodness knows how long." "Why? Were you thinking of selling it?" He did not answer. "Do you remember the second Mrs. Chapin?" she demanded. This was a bold, brazen little black-browed woman, a widow for choice, who on Sophie's death was guilefully to marry George for his wealth and ruin him in a year. George being busy, Sophie had invented her some 2 years after her marriage, and conceived she was alone among wives in so doing. "You aren't going to bring her up again?" he asked anxiously. "I only want to say that I should hate anyone who bought pardons 10 times worse than I used to hate the second Mrs. Chapin. Think what we've put into it of our 2 selves." "At least a couple of $1,000,000 I know I could have made," he broke off. "The beasts," she went on. "They'd be sure to build a red brick lodge at the gates, and cut the lawn up for bedding out. You must leave instructions in your will that he's never to do that, George, won't you?" He laughed, and took her hand again, but said nothing till it was time to dress. Then he muttered, "What the devil's use is a man's country to him when he can't do business in it?" Friar's Pardon stood faithful to its tradition. At the appointed time was born, not that third in their party to whom Sophie meant to be so kind, but a godling. In beauty it was manifest, excellent Eros. as in wisdom Confucius, an enhancer of delights, a renewer of companionships, and an interpreter of destiny. This last George did not realize till he met Lady Conant striding through Dutton Shaw a few days after the event. "My dear fellow," she cried, and slapped him heartily on the back, "I can't tell you how glad we all are. Oh, she'll be all right. There's never been any trouble over the birth of an heir at Pardon's. Now, where the deuce is it?" She felt largely in her leather-bound skirt and drew out a small silver mug. "I sent a note to your wife about it, but my silly ass of a groom forgot to take this. You can save me a trump. Give her my love." She marched off amid her guard of grave Airedales. The mug was worn and dented. Above the twined initials G.L. was the crest of a footless bird, and the motto, "Wait a while, wait a while." "That's the other end of the riddle," Sophie whispered when he saw her that evening. "Read her note. The English write beautiful notes." "The warmest of welcomes to your little man. I hope he will appreciate his native land now he has come to it. Though you have said nothing, we cannot of course look on him as a little stranger, and so I am sending him the old Lashmar christening mug. It has been with us since Gregory Lashmar, your great-grandmother's brother." George stared at his wife. "Go on," she twinkled from the pillows. "Mother's brother sold his place to Walter's family. We seem to have acquired some of your household gods at that time, but nothing survives except the mug and the old cradle, which I found in the potting shed, and am having put in order for you. I hope little George Lashmar, he will be too, won't he, will live to see his grandchildren cut their teeth on his mug. Affectionately yours, Alice Conant. P.S. How quiet you've kept about it all." "Well, I'm—" "Don't swear," said Sophie. "Bad for the infant, mind." "But how in the world did she get at it? Have you ever said a word about the Lashmars?" "You know the only time. To young Eagledon at Rocket's, when Eagledon died. Your great-grandmother's brother. She traced the whole connection, more than your Aunt Sydney could do." "What does she mean about our keeping quiet?" Sophie's eyes sparkled. "I've thought that out too. We've got back at the English at last. Can't you see that she thought that we thought my mother's being a Lashmar was one of those things we'd expect the English to find out for themselves, and that's impressed her?" She turned the mug in her white hands and sighed happily. "Wait a while, wait a while. That's not a bad motto, George. It's been worth it. But still, I don't quite see. I shouldn't wonder if they don't think our coming here was part of a deep-laid scheme to be near our ancestors. They'd understand that. And look how they've accepted us, all of them." "Are we so undesirable in ourselves?" George grunted. "Be just, my lord. That wretched Sangra's man has twice our money. Can you see Marn Conant slapping him between the shoulders? Not by a jackful. The poor beast doesn't exist." "Do you think it's that, then?" He looked toward the cot by the fire, where the godling snorted. "The minute I get well, I shall find out from Mrs. Cloak what every Lashmar gives in doles, that's nicer than tips, every time a Lashmeet is born. I've done my duty thus far, but there's much expected of me." Entered here Mrs. Cloak, and hung worshipping over the cot. They showed her the mug, and her face shone. "Oh, now Lady Conant sent it, it'll be all proper, ma'am, won't it? George, of course, he'd have to be, but seeing what he is, we was hoping, all your people was hoping, it would be Lashmar too, and that would just round it out. A very handsome mug, quite unique, I should imagine. Wait a while, wait a while. That's true with the Lashmars, I've heard. Very slow to fill their houses, they are. Most like Master George won't open his nursery till he's 30. "Poor lamb!" cried Sophie. "But how did you know my folk were Lashmars?" Mrs. Cloak thought deeply. "I'm sure I can't quite say, ma'am, but I've a belief likely that it was something you may have let drop to young Eagledon when you was at Rocket's. That may have been what give us an inkling. And so it came out, one thing in the way of talk leading to another, and those American people at Veering Holler was very obliging with news, I'm told, ma'am." "Great Scott!" said George under his breath. "And this is the simple peasant!" Yes, Miss Cloak went on, and Cloak was only wondering this afternoon, your pillow's slipped, my dear, you mustn't lie that away, just for the sake of saying something, whether you wouldn't think, well now, of getting the Lashmore farms back, sir. They don't rightly round off Sir Walter's estate, they come catering across us more. Cloak, he would be glad to show you over any day. But Sir Walter doesn't want to sell, does he? We can find out from his bailiff, sir, but, with cold contempt, I think that trained nurse is just coming up from her dinner, so I'm afraid we'll have to ask you, sir. Now, Master George, aye, wake a little minute, Lummy. A few months later, the three of them were down at the brook in the Gale Anstey woods to consider the rebuilding of a footbridge carried away by spring floods. George Lashmore Chapin wanted all the bluebells on God's earth that day to eat, and Sophie adored him in a voice like to the cooing of a dove. So business was delayed. "Here's the place," said his father at last among the water forget-me-nots. "But where the deuce are the larch poles, Cloak? I told you to have them down here ready." "We'll get 'em down, if you say so," Cloak answered, with a thrust of the under lip they both knew. "But I did say so. What on earth have you brought that timber tag here for? We aren't building a railway bridge. Why, in America, half a dozen 2x4 bits would be ample." "I don't know nothing about that," said Cloak, "and I've nothing to say against larch, if you want to make a temporary job of it. I ain't here to tell you what isn't so, sir, and you can't say I ever come creeping up on you, or trying to lead you further in than you set out." A year ago George would have danced with impatience. Now he scraped a little mud off his old gaiters with his spade and waited. "All I say is that you can put up larch and make a temporary job of it, and by the time the young master's married it'll have to be done again. Now I've brought down a couple of as sweet 6x8 oak timbers as I've ever drawed. You put 'em in, and it's off your mind for good and all. T'other way, I don't say it ain't right, I'm only just saying what I think, but t'other way, he'll no sooner be married than he'll have it all to do again. You've no call to regard my words, but you can't get out of that." "No," said George after a pause. "I've been realizing that for some time. Make it oak then, we can't get out of it." End of section 1.